Make sure every seat in that ballroom sees her when she walks in," the groom said with a calm smile that carried no warmth, only certainty. The wedding planner hesitated, then nodded as if it was just another detail of luxury, not humiliation. Across the glass-walled venue overlooking the city skyline, guests were already whispering about the ex-wife who would soon arrive, expecting her to look small, broken, forgotten. Someone laughed softly near the bar, saying she probably would not even dare to show up. Another voice added, "She was never meant to belong in a room like this anyway." The words floated through the space like entertainment, not cruelty, as if her pain was part of the evening's design. And somewhere in that same room, a sealed invitation envelope sat on the table labeled with her name, placed deliberately where she could not ignore it. The groom glanced at it once, then looked away, as if the outcome was already decided. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of man plans a wedding around the destruction of someone he once claimed to love? The guests kept arriving, dressed in perfection, unaware that the center of their entertainment had not even stepped into the building yet. But the groom's voice remained steady, almost satisfied. "She will come. People like her always do when they think they have something left to prove." A few guests nodded, amused, already imagining the scene. Another glass clinked in agreement, sealing an atmosphere built on expectation of humiliation. Micro cliffhanger. But none of them noticed the second invitation, the one marked reserved, placed at a table closest to the stage with no explanation. The bride glanced at it briefly, uneasy for a fraction of a second, before forcing a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Meanwhile, far across the city, a woman sat alone in a quiet apartment staring at the same invitation, her expression unreadable, as if she was looking at something far heavier than paper. The silence around her was not empty. It was controlled, deliberate, like someone had learned long ago how to survive being erased. Micro cliffhanger. Why did she not react the way someone defeated was supposed to react? The groom's world had once consumed her completely. 7 years of pressure, judgment, and constant reminders that she had failed to give him what his family demanded. They had called it a lack, a flaw, a reason she could be replaced. And he had let them. That was the part she never forgot. Micro cliffhanger. What does a person become after being erased and blamed for everything they could not control? In the wedding venue, laughter continued, sharper now, as someone replayed the story of the woman who could not provide an heir, turning her past into public entertainment. The groom did not correct them. He only adjusted his cufflinks and said quietly, "Tonight closes a chapter." But his tone carried something else beneath it, something almost like anticipation, as if he was waiting for a reaction he believed he already understood. Micro cliffhanger. But what if the chapter he was closing was not the one he thought it was? The woman at home finally moved, placing the invitation down with slow precision, her fingers steady in a way that did not match the storm she had lived through. A memory flickered, cold voices, empty rooms, the sound of judgment disguised as concern. Then silence again. She had survived that silence. She had learned what it meant. And now, something about the invitation no longer felt like an insult. It felt like a door left intentionally open. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when someone stops fearing the place they were meant to be destroyed in? The groom's voice echoed in her memory as if carried through time, though he was not there. She will come alone. She always does. But this time, the certainty in that statement felt fragile, like a mistake waiting to be exposed. The air in the wedding venue grew brighter, louder, more confident, unaware of the shift beginning outside its walls. Micro cliffhanger, because somewhere between humiliation and expectation, something had already started to change. The woman stood slowly, finally breaking the stillness of her apartment, her hand resting on the invitation as if making a decision that had been delayed for years. No tears, no hesitation, only clarity, the kind that comes after everything else has already been taken. And then, she spoke one sentence into the empty room, quiet but absolute. "If they want me there." I will go. Micro cliffhanger. And none of them understood what that meant yet. The silence in her apartment did not last long before the past forced its way back in, not as memory alone, but as weight, as pressure, as something that never truly ended. She stood there holding the invitation, but her mind was no longer in the present. It was pulled backward into years she had tried to bury, years where every room she entered carried the same invisible judgment. It started with small comments at first, disguised as concern, people asking when she would finally bring good news, as if her value depended on a single outcome she could not control. Then it escalated into something sharper, colder, more public. His family never needed to shout to make her feel small. They only needed silence in the right moments, glances that lingered too long, conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Micro cliffhanger. How long can a person stay whole in a place where they are treated like a permanent mistake? She remembered nights where she sat alone waiting for him to speak up, waiting for him to defend her, but he never did in the way she needed. He would sometimes sigh, sometimes look away, sometimes say nothing at all, and that silence became louder than any insult. It was not one moment that broke her, but thousands of moments that repeated until she started questioning herself. The worst part was not what they said about her, but what he allowed them to say. Micro cliffhanger. What does it do to someone when the person who promised protection becomes the quietest witness to their pain? The pressure around children was constant, like air she could not escape. Every family gathering turned into an interrogation disguised as tradition. Every conversation looping back to the same expectation that she was failing at something she was never truly given space to understand. Doctors were visited, tests were done, hope was discussed like a business plan that never produced results. And each time nothing changed, the weight did not fall on the system, it fell on her. She started to feel as if her body had become an argument she was losing in front of everyone. Micro cliffhanger. How do you survive in a life where your existence is treated like evidence of failure? She remembered one night more clearly than the rest, not because it was the loudest, but because it was the quietest. He had come home later than usual, his expression already hardened before he even spoke. The house felt tense, like it knew something was about to break. He placed his keys down without looking at her and said her name as if it already carried disappointment. The conversation that followed was not a conversation at all, but a conclusion he had already reached. He spoke about pressure, about expectations, about time running out in ways that did not include her feelings. She tried to explain, tried to ask for patience, tried to say the words that had been building inside her for years, but every sentence she spoke seemed to disappear before it reached him. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when your voice no longer reaches the person you are speaking to? There were moments she tried to hold on to what they had built, moments she suggested doctors, alternatives, anything that could keep the relationship from collapsing under assumptions. But even those efforts began to feel like resistance to something already decided. His responses grew shorter, colder, more distant, until even hope felt inappropriate to express. The family did not need to push him anymore. The narrative had already taken shape, and she was the center of it in the worst possible way. Micro cliffhanger. When a story is written about you without your consent, is there any way to change its ending? And yet, through all of it, there was one detail she never fully understood until much later, something subtle at the time but heavier in hindsight. There were conversations that stopped when she entered the room, private discussions that resumed only after she left, decisions made without her presence that still defined her life. She had once believed she was part of a shared struggle, but slowly it became clear she was the only one fighting. Still, she stayed longer than she should have, not because she did not see the truth, but because she still believed it could change. Micro cliffhanger. How much pain does it take before hope itself becomes a mistake? That final night before everything ended did not feel like an explosion, but like something quietly reaching its limit. The air in the room was heavy, not with anger, but with exhaustion that had turned into distance. He spoke about endings in a way that suggested they had already happened internally, long before any words were spoken out loud. She remembered trying one last time to reach him, to remind him of what they once promised each other, but the space between them had already grown too wide. Micro cliffhanger. What if the decision that ended everything was made long before you were ever told? And even now, standing in her present silence, she realized something she had avoided fully naming until this moment, that the invitation in her hand was not the beginning of her return, but the continuation of a story that had never properly ended. Somewhere inside that unresolved past, there was still a missing piece, a moment she never fully understood, something that happened before the divorce that no one had ever explained to her clearly, something that now felt like it was about to matter again in ways she could not yet see. Micro cliffhanger. And what if the truth of that final moment before the divorce was the one thing they never wanted her to remember? The thought that something had been left unresolved before the divorce did not leave her mind. It stayed like a quiet pressure behind every breath, but she forced herself to move. Because remembering was no longer enough. Not anymore. What mattered now was what had happened after everything fell apart. The part no one ever talked about. The part that had no witnesses. After that final night, there was no dramatic exit, no scene that people would later describe with certainty. There was only silence. And then she was gone from the world that had once defined her. At first, even she did not realize how complete that disappearance would become. It started with simple things, her name no longer appearing in familiar conversations, her number no longer saved in places it used to be, her presence no longer required anywhere she once belonged. Micro cliffhanger. How quickly can a person vanish before the world stops noticing they existed at all? The city she once moved through every day continued without hesitation. The same roads, the same buildings, the same routines of people who never paused long enough to remember she was no longer part of them. Even the family that once filled every space in her life seemed to accept the absence without resistance, as if erasing her had been easier than explaining her absence. There were no calls that mattered, no messages that carried weight, no attempts that reached her. It was not that she was unreachable. It was that she had become irrelevant to the system that once controlled her entire life. Micro cliffhanger. What does it mean when silence is not forced on you, but chosen because no one is looking for you anymore? She did not speak about where she went. Not to anyone. Because there was no one left who had earned that answer. The first days after leaving were not about rebuilding. They were about surviving without identity, without the structure that had once defined every decision she made. There were no more expectations pressing on her shoulders, but there was also no direction to replace them. That absence was heavier than she expected. Still, she kept moving forward because stopping would have meant thinking too deeply about what had been taken from her. Micro cliffhanger. When everything familiar disappears, what version of yourself is left behind? Time passed without ceremony. She no longer measured it by events or conversations, but by distance from what she used to be. Slowly, something inside her began to shift, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice from the outside, but in the smallest decisions she made when no one was watching. She learned how to exist without asking for permission. She learned how to move without explaining herself. And most importantly, she learned how to observe the world without needing to belong to it. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when someone who was trained to disappear finally stops feeling afraid of being unseen? But even in this quiet reconstruction of self, there were fragments of the past that refused to dissolve. Names she avoided thinking about. Places she never returned to. Conversations she replayed without meaning to. The memory of being constantly evaluated still lingered in her instincts. Like a reflex, she had not fully unlearned it. And yet, over time, even that reflex began to weaken. Not because the pain disappeared, but because it no longer had control over her actions. Micro cliffhanger. Can a person truly escape a life that shaped their entire sense of worth? It was during this unseen period that something began to change. though at first it was so subtle it could have been dismissed as coincidence. A shift in how people reacted when they heard her name or thought they heard it. A hesitation in conversations that should have ended quickly. A brief pause in systems that once erased her without effort. None of it was loud enough to be called evidence, but it was there, like something beneath the surface slowly adjusting its position. Micro cliffhanger. What if the world that erased you never fully closed the door? Behind you? She noticed at first in small, disconnected moments. A document that should have been gone but resurfaced briefly before disappearing again. A reference that no longer made sense in places it should not exist. A financial trace that did not align with the version of her life everyone believed had ended. At first, she dismissed it, because believing it meant accepting that something larger had been happening without her knowledge. But patterns do not appear without cause, and this one was beginning to form. Micro cliffhanger. How do you react when proof of your forgotten existence starts appearing where it should not? She stood one evening near a window she did not own years ago, staring at nothing in particular, when she realized something unsettling. The life she had been forced to leave behind was not as closed as she had believed. It had gaps, unexplained spaces, missing explanations that no one had ever given her. And now, those gaps were beginning to echo back toward her. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough to make her aware that her story had not actually ended where she thought it had. Micro cliffhanger. And what happens when the past you were erased from begins to look like it was never finished at all? The realization that her past was not fully closed followed her into the next phase of her life like a shadow that had learned how to walk on its own. She did not tell anyone what she had begun to notice, because even saying it out loud would make it feel too real. But the pattern was there, growing slowly, refusing to stay buried. It started with small disruptions that seemed meaningless on their own. A record that should have been archived appearing briefly before being removed again. A conversation between two unfamiliar voices that stopped the moment her name was mentioned. A reference in a system she had no access to anymore, suggesting she was still attached to something that no longer existed on paper. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of past continues to move even after it has been declared finished? She began to understand that disappearance is not always the same as erasure. There is a difference between being forgotten and being deliberately placed somewhere no one is allowed to look. That thought unsettled her more than she expected because it implied intention. And intention meant someone had chosen how her life would be remembered or not remembered at all. The silence around her past no longer felt natural. It felt managed, controlled, like a story edited by unseen hands. Micro cliffhanger. If your entire existence can be edited, then who decided what the world was allowed to remember about you? Meanwhile, across the city she no longer officially belonged to, life continued in places that still carried fragments of her former identity. A name spoken too quickly in a conversation that suddenly ended. A legal document reviewed and then quietly set aside without explanation. A financial reference flagged, then cleared, then flagged again as if someone was unsure whether it should exist. None of it formed a complete picture, but together it created something unsettling. Attention. Not loud attention, not public attention, but precise, selective attention. The kind that suggests someone is actively checking, watching without announcing themselves. Micro cliffhanger. Why would a life that was supposed to be erased suddenly require verification again? She felt it most strongly in moments of stillness. When she was alone and the world was quiet enough for thoughts to surface without interruption. There was a difference now in the way she processed uncertainty. Earlier in her life, uncertainty had meant fear. Now it meant pattern recognition. And patterns, once seen, could not be unseen. She started to map them mentally, connecting fragments that had no obvious relationship. A delay here, a correction there, a name that appeared where it should not, then vanished before she could confirm it. It was not enough to form proof, but it was enough to form doubt about everything she had been told about her own disappearance. Micro cliffhanger. What if the absence you survived was not random, but designed with precision? The idea did not comfort her. It did the opposite. Because if someone had gone to the effort of controlling what remained of her after she left, then her exit from that world had never been as simple as she believed. It meant there were layers she had never been allowed to see. Decisions made without her. Outcomes shaped without her input. A version of her life constructed and then quietly stored away. And now, something was disturbing that structure. Something was making it unstable. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when a life that was carefully hidden begins to leave traces again? She found herself returning to one specific thought more often than she wanted to admit. The invitation was not just a call to return. It was a signal, a deliberate point of contact placed after years of silence. And signals are never random. They are sent for a reason. Whether that reason is closure, confrontation, or correction, she could not yet tell. But she understood one thing clearly now. She was not being pulled back into her past. Her past was being pulled toward her. Micro cliffhanger. And if that was true, then who had started reaching for her first? The sensation that something was being drawn toward her rather than her being pulled back into it did not fade as she tried to continue her life. It followed her into every quiet moment, like a pressure behind the world itself, something she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. She began to notice a new pattern forming within the older one, not just traces of her past appearing in systems and conversations, but reactions to those traces. As if someone, somewhere, was actively responding to her existence resurfacing. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of system reacts when something it erased starts to move again? That question lingered as she moved through her day, unable to find comfort in routine anymore. Even ordinary moments felt slightly misaligned, as if the world was no longer fully synchronized with itself. A notification on a screen that disappeared too quickly. A paused conversation in a public space the moment she passed by. A glance from a stranger that lasted a fraction too long before being withdrawn. None of it was enough to confirm anything, but together they created a feeling she could not ignore. Observation. Not casual attention, but structured awareness. Micro cliffhanger. When does coincidence stop being coincidence and start becoming surveillance? She tried to anchor herself in logic, to remind herself that after years of emotional exhaustion, the mind can create meaning from randomness. But the pattern resisted dismissal because it kept escalating in subtle intensity. The same references she had seen before were no longer just appearing. They were being corrected, adjusted, re-verified, as if the world was reconciling conflicting versions of her existence. That was the detail that unsettled her most. Not that she was forgotten, but that she was being checked again. Micro cliffhanger. Why would something erased need to be verified unless it was never fully gone? Meanwhile, in the unseen structure behind those fragments, something else was beginning to take shape. Not loud enough to be recognized as action, but precise enough to be intentional. Records that had remained dormant for years were no longer static. They were being accessed, reviewed, and quietly compared against newer data. Nothing visible pointed to who was doing it, but the pattern of access suggested discipline, control, and purpose. This was not curiosity. It was confirmation. Micro cliffhanger. Who would reopen a closed story without telling the person at its center? She stopped ignoring it when a single moment broke the illusion of randomness. A reference that had disappeared completely days ago briefly returned, not as a mistake, but as if it had been deliberately restored for a single observation before vanishing again. That moment changed the weight of everything. It was no longer about memory or coincidence. It was about intent. Someone was not only aware of her existence resurfacing, they were responding to it in real time. Micro cliffhanger. What does it mean when your past starts reacting faster than you can understand it? She felt a shift internally after that realization. Not fear in its rawest form, but something more structured, like awareness forming into clarity. If there was a system tracking what remained of her life, then the invitation she held could not be random. It was not nostalgia. It was not closure. It was contact. A controlled opening between two sides of a story that had been separated for too long. And that meant everything she thought she understood about her disappearance was incomplete. Micro cliffhanger. If contact has been initiated, then what was the purpose of waiting until now? The thought did not bring comfort. It brought precision. Because now she understood that silence had never been empty. It had been maintained. And anything maintained can be disrupted. She looked again at the invitation, no longer seeing paper, but a signal embedded within years of silence. Something designed to bring her to a specific place at a specific time. Not as a guest, but as an answer. Micro cliffhanger. And if she was the answer, then what question had they been asking all this time? The invitation no longer felt like an object she was holding. It felt like something that had already been activated. The moment she acknowledged it as a signal, everything around her began to feel less like coincidence and more like alignment, as if distant pieces of a system were quietly converging toward a single point. She did not move for a long time, not because she was afraid, but because she was calculating without fully realizing it. Every fragment she had seen over the past days now connected into a pattern she could not ignore. Nothing had been random. Not the resurfaced records, not the corrected traces, not the brief reappearances of her forgotten existence. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of system keeps a record of someone it officially erased? She finally placed the invitation down on the table, not with hesitation, but with a controlled precision that felt unfamiliar even to her. It was no longer just a wedding invitation. It was a coordinate, a fixed point in time where everything that had been hidden would intersect again. And the most unsettling part was not that she was being pulled back, but that whoever sent it already knew she would understand that fact. Micro cliffhanger. How long had they been waiting for her to recognize this pattern? She began preparing without telling herself she was preparing. There was no dramatic decision, no emotional break. Instead, there was a quiet shift in how she interpreted everything around her. The silence in her life was no longer empty. It was structured. Even her isolation felt engineered now, as if distance had been maintained rather than accidental. That thought changed something fundamental in how she viewed her past years. They had not simply forgotten her. They had stopped her from being seen, while still keeping track of where she might resurface. Micro cliffhanger. If you are not remembered, but still monitored, what does that make your absence? She stepped outside for the first time that day, and the world felt different under that new awareness. People passed by without knowing that she was no longer just a woman returning to a difficult memory, but a variable inside a system that had already begun adjusting to her reappearance. A car passed too slowly. A stranger's attention lingered too long before breaking away. Small things, but now they aligned into something consistent. She no longer dismissed them. She read them. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when awareness replaces denial in a system designed to stay hidden? Somewhere in that unseen structure, the response to her recognition had already begun. The moment she understood that she was not simply being invited, but positioned, something else became active. Not louder, not visible, but responsive. The system she had unknowingly triggered did not react emotionally. It reacted procedurally, quietly, adjusting timing, adjusting visibility, adjusting distance, as if her understanding itself had changed the conditions of engagement. Micro cliffhanger. Can a past designed to remain silent adapt when the person inside it begins to see the pattern? She stopped in front of a glass window, seeing her reflection layered over the city behind her. For the first time, she did not see confusion or uncertainty. She saw alignment. Everything she had felt without proof now had structure beneath it. The invitation was not calling her back to a place. It was activating a moment that had been prepared in advance, long before she understood it. And now, understanding had become the final piece required for motion to begin. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when understanding itself becomes the trigger for return? She turned away from the window slowly, as if the decision had already been made somewhere outside of her awareness. The invitation was no longer an option. It was timing. And timing, once recognized, cannot be ignored. The system had already accounted for her awareness. It had expected it. And now, it was adjusting for what came next. Micro cliffhanger. And if everything was already accounted for, then what exactly was waiting for her at the wedding that had been designed to bring her back? The moment she understood that the invitation was not just an object but a timed mechanism, everything around her began to feel sharper, as if reality itself had tightened its focus. She no longer saw her situation as something drifting toward her. It was moving with direction, with intent, with precision she could not yet fully measure. And now, that direction had a destination. The wedding was not just waiting for her. It was structured around her arrival. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of event is built around a person who was supposed to be erased from it? The thought did not create fear. It created awareness. She moved through her space with a quiet certainty, not rushing, not hesitating, but adjusting herself to something larger than emotion. Every detail she had noticed in the past days now aligned into a single truth. Her presence was not incidental. It was required. And that requirement meant others had already prepared for her reaction. Micro cliffhanger. If your reaction is already anticipated, are you still free to choose it? Across the city, the wedding preparations had reached a level of refinement that no longer felt like celebration, but execution of expectation. Guests arrived not only dressed for luxury, but for performance, as if each of them had been assigned a role in something they did not fully understand. The atmosphere was light on the surface, but underneath it carried a controlled tension, the kind that appears when something important is about to be revealed, but has not yet been named. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when a celebration quietly becomes a staged confrontation? She stepped outside again, and this time the city did not feel random at all. It felt structured, as if distances between people, timing of movement, and even the flow of attention had been subtly arranged around a central point she had not yet reached. The invitation in her possession was no longer just a signal. It was a confirmation that she was already inside something larger than herself, even before she arrived. Micro cliffhanger. How do you recognize a system you were never told you were part of? At the venue, anticipation had already transformed into certainty. Not because anything had been revealed, but because expectation itself had matured into belief. The groom moved through the space with calm confidence, his words to others carrying the weight of someone who believed the outcome had already been settled. There was no doubt in his tone, only timing, as if everything was simply waiting for the correct moment to align. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of confidence exists before a truth is even tested? Yet beneath that confidence, something subtle began to shift in how people reacted when her name was mentioned. It was not fear. Not yet. It was recognition without understanding. A hesitation that did not belong in a place designed for celebration. Conversation slowed when the topic came too close. Smiles tightened briefly before returning. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when certainty begins to fracture before the event even begins? She did not see this directly, but she felt its existence through the way the invitation seemed heavier in her hand now, not physically, but conceptually, as if it carried more than just access. It carried consequence, and consequence always implies that something irreversible has been prepared. Micro cliffhanger. If a moment is designed for consequence, then what exactly is about to be concluded? Inside the venue, there was no visible disruption yet, but the air had changed in a way that could not be explained by decoration or timing. It was anticipation without source. Everyone was waiting for something they had not been fully told about, yet none of them questioned why they were waiting. That was the most unsettling part. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of event makes people wait without asking what they are waiting for? And somewhere between her awareness and their expectation, the distance between her and the wedding no longer felt physical. It felt inevitable, like two ends of a structure finally preparing to connect. She stopped for a moment, sensing that whatever was about to happen had already begun in ways no one could reverse. Micro cliffhanger. And if the beginning has already started before arrival, then what remains to be witnessed when she finally steps inside? The moment she stepped into motion toward the wedding was not dramatic. It was final, a quiet acceptance that whatever had been building around her no longer belonged to the realm of interpretation, but execution. She did not feel pulled anymore. She felt aligned with something already moving ahead of her. And that feeling was more unsettling than uncertainty. Micro cliffhanger. What does it mean when you are no longer approaching an event, but being positioned inside it? At the venue, the atmosphere had already shifted into something tighter, more focused, as if the celebration had begun to lose its softness without anyone acknowledging it. Conversation still happened, music still played, but underneath it all there was a subtle contraction of attention, like the room itself was waiting for a signal it could not name. Micro cliffhanger. How does a celebration become tense before anything has visibly changed? She did not yet enter. Instead, she paused at the threshold distance, not physically but perceptually, as if something about the structure of this moment required her awareness before her presence. The invitation in her mind was no longer a piece of paper or a signal. It had become confirmation that she was expected not as a guest, but as a variable in the outcome of the evening. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of expectation transforms a guest into a turning point? Inside, the groom moved with controlled confidence, greeting people with the ease of someone who believed the narrative had already been written correctly. There was no visible doubt in him, only timing. Every gesture suggested that he was not waiting for an unknown outcome, but for a scheduled one. Yet, even within that confidence, there were small fractures forming in how people reacted when her presence was mentioned indirectly. Not panic, not alarm, something more fragile. Recognition without clarity. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when recognition appears before understanding? She took one step closer mentally, and suddenly the space between her and the venue no longer felt like distance. It felt like inevitability tightening, as if the moment of entry had already occurred somewhere in the structure of expectation, and what remained was only physical confirmation. That realization did not make her hesitate. It refined her focus. Micro cliffhanger. Can inevitability exist before action, or is action already happening in another form? Inside the venue, the tone of conversations subtly changed whenever certain names or topics approached proximity to her. It was not obvious disruption, but micro-adjustments in behavior. A pause too long. A sentence not completed. A glance redirected too quickly. These were not accidents anymore. They formed a pattern of anticipation that no one was openly acknowledging. Micro cliffhanger. Why do people adjust behavior for something that has not yet arrived? The groom's confidence remained intact on the surface, but it now carried a new quality. Expectation of response. As if he believed the outcome was not just planned, but already validated somewhere beyond visible interaction. Yet that certainty depended on a version of her that no longer existed in the same form. And that mismatch created a tension that no one in the room could name. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when certainty is built on an outdated version of reality? She finally began moving toward the entrance, not hurried, not delayed, but precise. Each step felt like a transition from observation into participation in something already in motion. The threshold was no longer symbolic. It was active, and crossing it would not start the event. It would reveal it. Micro cliffhanger. What is revealed when the observer becomes the observed? The air inside the venue felt heavier at the exact moment she reached the final point before entry. Not because anything had changed visually, but because expectation had reached saturation. The system, whatever it was, had reached the limit of waiting. Everything now depended on her presence confirming what had already been. Prepared. Micro cliffhanger. And when preparation meets arrival, what exactly breaks first? She stopped for only a fraction of a second before stepping forward, not out of fear, but because she understood something fundamental. Nothing about this moment was spontaneous. It had structure. It had timing. It had intention. And she was no longer outside it. Micro cliffhanger. And if she was already inside the structure, then what would she see when it finally acknowledged her arrival? She stepped forward, and the moment she crossed the threshold, the environment inside the venue did not react loudly. It reacted precisely, not with chaos, but with recognition. The kind of recognition that happens when a system confirms a long-anticipated variable has finally entered its field of operation. Micro cliffhanger. What does it feel like to be acknowledged by a room that was prepared for your arrival? The conversations did not stop immediately. Instead, they slowed, like sound itself needed time to adjust. One by one, people began to notice without fully understanding what they were noticing. It was not her appearance alone that shifted the atmosphere. It was the fact that she did not look like someone arriving late to an event. She looked like someone arriving at a moment that had been waiting for her. Micro cliffhanger. When does presence become disruption without a single word being spoken? From the far end of the venue, the groom turned. The motion was subtle at first, almost routine, until it was not. His expression did not collapse. It recalibrated, as if his mind had to briefly reprocess the input it was receiving. This was not the version of her he had expected to validate the narrative he had constructed. Something in the alignment was off. Not wrong. Not missing. Different. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when expectation meets a version of reality it did not design? The guests followed his gaze, and the silence expanded, not because anyone commanded it, but because attention naturally converged toward the same point. The room, once filled with rehearsed celebration, now carried a thin layer of instability. A tension that did not belong to emotion alone, but to uncertainty about what role they were now supposed to play. Micro cliffhanger. How quickly can celebration turn into observation when no one knows the script anymore? She did not speak. That silence itself became the center of attention. Not passive silence, but controlled silence. The kind that suggests awareness rather than absence. Every step she took forward did not announce her presence. It measured it. And with each movement, the emotional balance of the room shifted slightly further away from certainty. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of silence makes an entire room question what it was told to believe? A woman near the front table leaned slightly toward another guest, whispering something that did not complete itself. The sentence died halfway, not because of interruption, but because continuation felt uncertain. That uncertainty spread in small, invisible waves, moving through clusters of people who had arrived expecting entertainment, not recalibration. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when an audience realizes it might be part of the event instead of watching it? The groom finally moved forward, not quickly, but with deliberate control, as if reasserting structure through motion. His expression was still composed, but now it carried a new layer, calculation replacing certainty. The narrative he had prepared for this moment was no longer fully aligned with what was unfolding. And yet, he continued forward, because stopping would mean acknowledging disruption. Micro cliffhanger. What does control look like when certainty begins to fracture in real time? She met his movement without reacting outwardly. No visible emotional shift, no attempt to reclaim space, no recognition of the tension as something unfamiliar. That absence of reaction did more than any confrontation could have. It forced interpretation. An interpretation, in a room like this, was dangerous. Micro cliffhanger. When silence refuses to respond, who is forced to fill the meaning? Around them, the guests began to sense it without being told. Something about this moment did not belong to the schedule they had mentally prepared for. The expectation of passive reunion or predictable discomfort was dissolving. Instead, there was alignment tension, as if two timelines were briefly overlapping without agreement on which one was real. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when two versions of a story occupy the same room at the same time? The groom's gaze tightened slightly. Not anger, not shock, something closer to recalculation. He had expected emotional validation of his certainty, not resistance through composure. And now, without any declaration, the structure of the evening was no longer behaving as designed. Micro cliffhanger. What breaks first when a controlled narrative encounters an uncontrollable presence? She stopped at a distance that felt neither close nor far, but intentionally placed. Not as guest, not as outsider, but as something the room had not yet classified. That ambiguity became the center of pressure, because ambiguity forces systems to choose meaning. And this system was beginning to hesitate. Micro cliffhanger. And when a system hesitates, what begins to emerge in the space between certainty and collapse? The hesitation in the room did not last long before it was interrupted, not by chaos, but by structure reasserting itself. A subtle shift in attention moved toward the center stage area where a figure from the groom's side stepped forward, holding something that immediately changed the emotional weight of the space. It was not dramatic in motion, but it was absolute in implication. A legal presence. A formal validation. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when uncertainty is replaced by institutional authority in a room already unstable? The groom did not look surprised by the action. That alone changed the tone of everything. It meant preparation had extended beyond this moment, beyond this room, beyond what anyone here could casually interpret as a social event. The guests who had been uncertain a moment ago now reoriented themselves toward the expectation of resolution. Not emotional resolution, procedural resolution. Micro cliffhanger. When does a wedding stop being a celebration and start becoming an announcement? She remained still, but stillness now meant something different than before. It was no longer ambiguity. It was resistance through observation. The kind that does not interrupt, but records. The groom's gaze tightened as the legal presence unfolded something that had clearly been prepared in advance. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with certainty that suggested multiple layers of verification had already been completed elsewhere. Micro cliffhanger. What kind of truth requires preparation before it is even spoken aloud? The atmosphere in the venue compressed further. Guests were no longer reacting to her presence alone, but to the implication that her arrival had triggered something procedural. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Attention was no longer emotional. It was administrative, and that change stripped warmth from the space instantly. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when emotion is replaced by process in a moment designed for celebration? The groom finally spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for the nearest guests to hear. His voice carried controlled confidence, but beneath it there was a sharper edge now, as if he was reinforcing a version of reality he believed could still hold. He was no longer addressing her as a person in the room. He was addressing her as a variable within an outcome that was already being defined. Micro cliffhanger. When does confidence become defense instead of control? She finally took a step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward visibility. That small movement altered the geometry of attention again. It forced every observer to recalibrate where the center of the moment actually was. The legal presence responded immediately, continuing its process without hesitation, as if her movement had been anticipated and already integrated into the sequence. Micro cliffhanger. What does it mean when your actions are already accounted for before you perform them? The groom's expression shifted slightly for the first time, not into shock, but into calculation under strain. The certainty he had carried earlier was still present, but now it had friction. Something in the unfolding process was not behaving like a performance. It was behaving like confirmation. And confirmation, once initiated, cannot be easily redirected. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when a planned narrative begins to validate something unexpected? The guests sensed it now with greater clarity. This was no longer about emotional confrontation. It was about information being revealed in layers they were not fully prepared to interpret. The room that had once been waiting for entertainment was now waiting for outcome. Micro cliffhanger. When does an audience realize it is witnessing consequence instead of drama? She remained silent, but her silence now functioned differently. It was not absence. It was containment, as if everything she did not say was being held in reserve for a moment that had not yet arrived. That restraint shifted perception again, making her presence feel less like an arrival and more like activation. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when silence feels more intentional than speech? The legal presence reached a point where the room collectively understood that something irreversible was being approached. Not emotionally irreversible, structurally irreversible. The kind of shift that does not depend on agreement, only acknowledgement. Micro cliffhanger. And what breaks first when acknowledgement becomes unavoidable? The groom's gaze locked onto her for a fraction longer than before, and in that moment, the certainty he had carried began to lose its stability. Not collapsing yet, but no longer unchallenged. The system he believed he had prepared was now producing outputs he did not fully control. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when control survives, but no longer leads? The legal presence prepared to finalize the next stage, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it had synchronized. Everything had reached a point where the next statement would determine not just interpretation, but direction. Micro cliffhanger. And when direction becomes irreversible, what exactly is about to be decided? The moment the legal process reached its final stage, the entire room shifted into a silence so complete it felt enforced rather than natural. It was not anticipation anymore. It was containment. Every guest, every gaze, every breath seemed aligned toward the same unavoidable point of resolution. The document in the legal representative's hand was no longer just information. It was consequence waiting to be spoken into reality. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when a single statement becomes heavier than an entire room full of expectations? The groom did not move, not because he was calm, but because moving would acknowledge uncertainty. His expression remained controlled, but the control now had tension in it. Like a structure holding weight it was no longer fully certain it could support. For the first time, the narrative he had been shaping was not advancing. It was waiting to be tested against something outside his influence. Micro cliffhanger. What does it feel like when your certainty stops progressing and starts waiting? She stood still, but her stillness was no longer passive. It was observational, precise, and increasingly detached from emotional reaction. She was no longer inside the moment as a participant alone. She was inside it as someone measuring how it unfolded. And that shift changed everything about how the room perceived her without anyone consciously realizing it. Micro cliffhanger. When does observation become authority without a single word spoken? The legal representative began to speak, and the sound of their voice immediately altered the emotional temperature of the space. Not because it was loud, but because it was final. Each phrase was structured, deliberate, and resistant to interpretation. There was no room for speculation anymore, only acknowledgement. The groom's gaze tightened, and for the first time, a fracture appeared in the composure he had maintained since her arrival. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when spoken truth cannot be shaped by expectation anymore? The guests reacted in fragmented silence. Some leaned forward instinctively, others froze completely, as if movement itself might change what was about to be confirmed. The room no longer functioned socially. It functioned structurally, as if everyone inside it had become part of an unfolding verification process they did not design. Micro cliffhanger. When does a gathering stop being a crowd and start becoming a witness system? She did not react outwardly, but internally something sharpened. Not surprise. Recognition. The procedural tone, the structured confirmation, the controlled progression of information, all of it pointed towards something she had already begun to sense earlier, but had not yet seen fully defined. This was not random confrontation. This was confirmation of alignment between hidden systems and visible reality. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when suspicion becomes structured confirmation? The groom finally spoke, but his voice now carried strain beneath its attempt at control. He was no longer shaping the room. He was responding to it. The difference was subtle but irreversible. His words attempted to assert continuity, but the continuity was already breaking under the weight of what was being revealed. Micro cliffhanger. What does it mean when your authority can still speak, but no longer define outcomes? The legal representative continued without pause, and that continuation itself became the most powerful force in the room, because it removed space for interruption, negotiation, or reinterpretation. Every second that passed reduced ambiguity further, compressing uncertainty into clarity that could no longer be reversed once acknowledged. Micro cliffhanger. And what breaks first when ambiguity is eliminated too quickly to resist? A ripple moved through the guests as fragments of understanding began to form, not fully coherent yet, but enough to disturb the emotional stability of the space. People were no longer reacting to her presence alone. They were reacting to what her presence meant in the structure being revealed in real time. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when meaning arrives before full understanding? She remained the still point in the room, but now that stillness carried weight that others could no longer ignore. It was not absence of reaction. It was containment of something that had not yet been released. That distinction shifted perception of her from participant to anchor of the entire unfolding event. Micro cliffhanger. When does silence become the most dominant force in a room full of voices? The groom's expression finally changed in a way that could not be hidden. Not collapse, not yet, but recalibration under pressure. Something in the unfolding confirmation was no longer aligning with the version of reality he had constructed, and that mismatch was beginning to expand. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when the structure you built starts responding differently than you intended? The legal representative reached the final point of the statement, and the entire room collectively reached the edge of something irreversible. Not emotionally irreversible, but structurally irreversible, where whatever is said next will determine direction rather than interpretation. Micro cliffhanger. And when direction itself is about to be set in stone, what exactly is about to be finalized? The room did not react immediately after the final statement began to unfold. It reacted in stages, like reality itself needed time to process what was being confirmed. The legal voice continued, steady and irreversible, each word tightening the structure of the moment until there was no longer space for interpretation, only recognition. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when truth arrives too clearly to be denied, but too suddenly to be emotionally processed? The groom's composure, which had been strained but intact, finally showed visible fracture. Not collapse, not yet, but a shift so subtle it was more dangerous than open reaction. His eyes moved once toward her, and in that movement there was something no longer anchored in certainty. It was not confusion alone. It was the beginning of loss of control over narrative. Micro cliffhanger. What does it mean when someone realizes too late that control was only temporary? She did not move, but now her stillness carried a different weight. The room was no longer interpreting her as a participant in an unfolding confrontation. She had become the reference point against which everything else was being measured. Every reaction, every silence, every shift in attention was now orbiting her presence whether she acknowledged it or not. Micro cliffhanger. When does a person stop being part of an event and become its center of gravity? The legal confirmation continued, and with each additional structured sentence, the emotional tension in the room transformed into something colder. Not panic, not chaos, something closer to forced acknowledgement. The kind that happens when denial becomes statistically impossible. Guests who had been whispering earlier now fell into rigid silence, their attention locked forward not because they understood everything, but because they understood enough. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when partial understanding is enough to change everything? The groom attempted to speak again, but his voice no longer carried the same authority as before. It entered the space, but it did not shape it. It was absorbed rather than received, like a signal losing strength in a system that had already moved beyond his influence. That realization did not arrive all at once. It accumulated in fragments of micro-awareness that slowly formed into something irreversible. Micro-cliffhanger. What breaks first when words no longer change outcomes? She finally shifted her gaze slightly, not toward him, but toward the structure unfolding in front of her. The legal process, the controlled language, the procedural certainty, it all pointed to something she had sensed earlier but could now no longer ignore. This was not merely exposure. It was validation of a reality that had been operating beneath visibility for longer than she had been allowed to see. Micro-cliffhanger. What does it feel like to realize you were always part of a structure you were never shown? The atmosphere in the venue tightened further. Even the guests who had arrived expecting spectacle now understood they were witnessing something irreversible, though not yet fully defined. The uncertainty had shifted from what would happen to how much of what was already happening they had failed to understand earlier. That shift created discomfort sharper than shock. Micro-cliffhanger. When does delayed understanding become more powerful than immediate revelation? The groom's expression hardened again, but it was no longer confidence returning. It was resistance forming against inevitability. A final attempt to hold structure in place through force of presence alone. But presence without alignment was no longer enough to stabilize the moment. The system around him had already moved beyond his capacity to redefine it. Micro-cliffhanger. What happens when resistance is no longer strong enough to alter direction? The legal voice reached its final structured point, and the room collectively entered a state where anticipation collapsed into finality. There was no longer waiting for information. There was only waiting for confirmation of what had already been implicitly understood. The emotional space of the room had been compressed into a single point of irreversible acknowledgement. Micro-cliffhanger. And when acknowledgement becomes unavoidable, what exactly is about to become permanent? The final sentence of the legal confirmation did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It arrived as closure. Clean, structured, irreversible. And in that instant, the room stopped functioning as a social space entirely. It became a system processing impact. Micro-cliffhanger. What happens when truth is not revealed but enforced into reality? The groom stood still for a moment that felt longer than it should have. Not because he did not understand what was being said, but because understanding and acceptance had separated from each other inside him. His expression did not break outwardly in chaos. It fractured internally in silence. The certainty he had carried into this moment no longer had a surface to stand on. Micro-cliffhanger. What collapses first when certainty loses its foundation but the body refuses to move? She remained exactly where she was, and for the first time since entering the venue, the entire room's attention did not shift around her. It locked onto her. Not as a participant, not as an observer, as the axis through which everything now made sense or failed to make sense. That distinction changed the emotional structure of the room completely. Micro-cliffhanger. When does being seen stop being perception and become consequence? The legal presence lowered the final document, signaling completion. No additional explanation followed. None was needed. The structure of what had been confirmed was already self-sustaining, and the absence of further words only strengthened its permanence. Guests began to process fragments of meaning in silence, each realization arriving at different speeds but converging toward the same unavoidable understanding. Micro-cliffhanger. What happens when understanding spreads faster than explanation can control? The groom finally moved, but it was not a step forward. It was a subtle adjustment backward, as if distance itself could restore clarity. It could not. His gaze remained fixed on her, not in confrontation, but in recalibration. The version of her he had constructed in his mind no longer aligned with the system that had just been validated in front of everyone. Micro-cliffhanger. What breaks when reality no longer matches the version you planned for others to believe? She did not speak. She did not need to. The silence around her had already become interpretation, and interpretation had already become certainty in the minds of those watching. The emotional center of the room no longer belonged to the groom, the guests, or the event itself. It belonged to the shift that had just been finalized. Micro cliffhanger. When does silence outweigh every explanation that came before it? A few guests looked away instinctively, unable to sustain the weight of what they now understood. Others remained frozen, caught between disbelief and forced acceptance. The atmosphere of celebration had fully dissolved, replaced by something more permanent, acknowledgement of a structure that had been hidden but was now undeniable. Micro cliffhanger. What happens when a room realizes it was never watching a celebration, but a correction? The groom's voice finally returned, but it did not carry authority. It carried recognition of loss. Not just loss of control, but loss of narrative ownership. The space he had once dominated through expectation was no longer responding to him in the way it used to. It had moved beyond him without permission. Micro cliffhanger. What does it mean when you are still present but no longer central to the outcome? She turned slightly, not toward him, but toward the space itself. And in that subtle motion, the room's final emotional structure shifted completely. The event was no longer about anticipation or revelation. It was about aftermath beginning before anyone had time to define it. Micro cliffhanger. And when aftermath begins before understanding is complete, what remains to be decided? The legal presence gathered the final acknowledgement in silence, sealing what had just been confirmed into permanence. No one spoke. No one interrupted. Because nothing could be interrupted anymore. The moment had already passed the threshold of change. Micro cliffhanger. And when a moment crosses that threshold, what exactly is left to continue?